I'm smoking a brisket overnight without a single alarm going off, without spritzing it once, and I'm sleeping through the entire cook the same way an old pitmaster outside Taylor taught me to 20 years ago. Most people think overnight brisket means waking up every 2 hours to check the fire, spray it down, and worry the whole thing's going to dry out or stall before sunrise. That's not how the old method works. Done right, you load the pit once before bed, walk away, and wake up to a brisket that's further along than anything you'd get babysitting it all night. By the end of this, you'll know the exact fire setup that holds heat for 8 to 10 hours unattended, the wrap timing that replaces spritzing entirely, and the one mistake that turns an overnight cook into a 3 a.m. emergency. Let's start with why spritzing and constant checking became the default in the first place, because understanding that is what makes the overnight method make sense. Spritzing caught on because it looks like it's doing something. You open the lid, miss the brisket with apple juice or vinegar or whatever your favorite mix happens to be, and it feels like you're actively managing the cook. But every time that lid comes open, you're dumping heat out of the chamber. And on a long cook, that heat loss adds up fast, especially overnight when the ambient temperature outside is dropping, right when you need the pit to hold steady the most. The old method treats the lid the way a good poker player treats their cards. You don't show them unless you have to. Bark forms through steady, unbroken heat and time, not through repeated moisture applications, and the moisture inside the meat itself is doing far more work protecting against dryness than anything you spray on from outside ever will. Now let's talk about the fire, because this is the entire foundation the rest of the method sits on. And it's the part people get wrong most often when they try to run a cook unattended for the first time. You need a fire that's built for longevity from the very first log, not a fire you're planning to feed every hour. That means starting with a full snake method or minion method coal bed, depending on what kind of smoker you're running. For an offset, that means banking a large volume of unlit charcoal and wood in a long row along one side of the firebox, then lighting one end with a small chimney of fully ashed over coals poured onto that end. The fire creeps down the row slowly over hours instead of burning everything at once, which is exactly the behavior you want for something that has to run itself while you're asleep. For a pellet smoker, this part's simpler. Fill the hopper completely before you start, verify your temperature probe is reading accurately, and set it and trust it, because that's the entire mechanism a pellet rig is built around in the first place. The wood matters here too. Larger splits burn slower and more predictably than small chunks. And for an overnight cook, you want fewer, bigger pieces, rather than a lot of small ones that burn hot and fast and leave gaps in your heat before the next one catches. Post oak, if you can get it, is the standard for a reason across most of Central Texas. It burns clean, holds a long, even coal, and doesn't throw the kind of sharp, bitter smoke that a fast-burning fruit wood can produce if it's not managed carefully through the night. Temperature target for an overnight cook sits a little lower than what you'd run during the day if you were tending the fire actively. Somewhere around 225 to 240 degrees, rather than the 250 to 275 range a lot of day cooks run. That lower range buys you more margin before anything drifts into a danger zone on either side. And it means the fire doesn't need to be fed as aggressively or as often to hold steady through 6 or 8 hours with nobody watching it. Let's talk about the wrap, because this is the actual mechanism that replaces spritzing, and it's the piece of the old method most people skip entirely. Around the stall, when the internal temperature of the brisket flattens out somewhere in the 160 to 170 range and seems to stop climbing no matter how long you wait, that's when the brisket goes into a wrap instead of getting another round of spray. Butcher paper is the traditional choice, breathable enough to let some moisture escape so the bark doesn't turn soft and mushy, but tight enough to trap enough humidity around the meat that it doesn't need external spritzing to stay protected through the rest of the cook. Wrap it tight, seam side down, and that's the last time the brisket needs to be touched until it's fully done. This is the part that replaces spritzing entirely, and it's worth being direct about why it works better for an unattended cook specifically. Spritzing manages moisture from outside the meat, which requires you to be there awake, checking, and reapplying on a schedule. The wrap manages moisture from a self-contained environment around the meat, which requires nothing from you once it's closed up. You're trading an active process that demands your presence for a passive one that doesn't. And that trade is the entire reason this method lets you actually sleep through the night instead of setting alarms every 90 minutes. If you're using foil instead of paper, understand you're trading a slightly different result for slightly more moisture retention. Foil holds in more steam, which can soften the bark more than paper does, but it also protects against temperature swings a little more aggressively, which some people prefer for an overnight cook specifically because it adds an extra margin of safety if the fire runs a touch hotter or cooler than planned at some point in the night. Either wrap works for this method. Paper if bark texture matters most to you, foil if you want the extra insurance. Now let's get into the actual timeline, because knowing roughly what's happening at each stage is what lets you trust the process enough to actually go to sleep instead of lying awake worrying about it. Start the fire and get your pit stabilized at temperature before the brisket goes on, not after. This usually takes 30 to 45 minutes depending on your setup, and it's worth doing this step wide awake and paying attention, because a stable starting point is what everything after it depends on. Once you're holding steady at your target temperature, the brisket goes on, fat side positioned according to your specific smoker's heat source, and that's when the clock actually starts. For a full packer brisket in the 12 to 14 pound range, plan on roughly an hour to an hour and 15 minutes of cook time per pound at this lower overnight temperature range, which puts a typical brisket somewhere around 12 to 16 hours total. Loaded at 10 or 11 at night, that puts you into the wraps sometime in the early morning hours, often while you're still asleep, and finish sometime around midday to early afternoon, well within a normal waking schedule, rather than forcing you to babysit a finish time that lands at 3 in the morning. Here's the part that took me a while to trust the first time I tried this method myself. You do not need to wake up for the wrap. If your fire's properly built and your pit's holding steady, the stall happens roughly on schedule based on the weight and your temperature range, predictably enough that you can estimate when it'll happen before you ever go to bed. Some people set a single alarm for that estimated window, just for peace of mind the first few times they try this, and there's nothing wrong with that if it helps you sleep easier while you're building trust in the method. But the old pit master who taught me this never set one at all. He loaded the pit, wrapped nothing until he woke up on his own in the morning, and just let the brisket ride through the stall unwrapped a little longer than ideal if that's what happened. A brisket left unwrapped through the stall for an extra hour or two isn't ruined. It just takes a little longer to push through, and an overnight cook has hours of built-in slack for exactly that reason. Let's talk about the equipment side of trusting a fire to run itself for 8 or more hours, because this is where a lot of the actual anxiety around overnight cooking comes from, and it's worth addressing directly. A reliable temperature probe system, ideally one with a phone app or a receiver you can check from bed without walking outside, removes almost all the guesswork here. You're not flying blind through the night, you're checking a number on a screen next to your bed if you happen to wake up anyway, without ever having to get up, go outside, and open the pit to find out what's happening. That single piece of equipment is doing more to make this method feel safe than almost anything else in the setup, because it turns an unknown into a known without requiring any action from you. Know your specific smoker's tendencies before you attempt a full overnight unattended cook for the first time. Every offset, every pellet grill, every Camker-style cooker holds heat a little differently, drifts in different directions as outside temperature drops overnight, and has its own quirks around airflow and fuel consumption. Run a few daytime cooks first, paying close attention to how your particular pit behaves over 6 or 8 hours before you trust it to run completely unattended while you're asleep and unable to respond quickly if something goes sideways. If you want the complete written breakdown of everything I've covered here, along with the exact overnight setups and troubleshooting notes I use on my own pit for brisket, ribs, and pulled pork, I put the whole thing together in the Texas BBQ playbook. It's the same method, just laid out as a full reference instead of the version you're getting in this video. Links in the description, and there's a QR code on screen right now if you'd rather scan it than go type it in. All right, back to the fire. Let's talk about weather, because outdoor temperature swings overnight are one of the biggest variables in whether this method holds up the way it's supposed to. A pit that holds rock steady at 70 degrees outside in the afternoon can drift noticeably once the temperature drops into the 40s or 50s overnight, especially in the hours right before dawn, which tend to run coldest. If you're cooking somewhere with real seasonal swings, account for that by building slightly more fuel into your initial setup than you think you need, and consider insulating your firebox or wrapping your pit's exterior with a welding blanket if you're running an offset through genuinely cold weather. That extra margin matters more overnight than during a daytime cook, precisely because you're not there to compensate for it by adding fuel or adjusting vents in real time. Wind is the other overnight variable people underestimate. A steady overnight breeze pulling heat off the side of your smoker can shift your actual cooking temperature more than people expect, even when the thermometer at the dome or the stack seems to read fine. If you know your setup and your yard well enough to predict which direction the wind usually comes from overnight, position your pit with that in mind, or add a simple windbreak on the exposed side before you load the meat and head to bed. Let's go through the mistakes now, because these are the ones that actually turn an overnight cook into a stressful morning instead of the easy one this method is supposed to deliver. The first mistake is starting the fire and loading the brisket without giving the pit real time to stabilize first. A fire that hasn't found its steady state yet is still climbing or settling when the meat goes on, and that instability early in the cook tends to compound over the following hours rather than correct itself on its own. Give it that 30 to 45 minutes of dialed in, steady temperature before the brisket ever touches the grate. The second mistake is underfueling the initial load because it looks like plenty of charcoal and wood sitting in the firebox before you've actually watched it burn for several hours. A pile that looks generous at 10 at night can run out faster than expected if it's not packed and arranged properly for a genuine, long, slow burn. When in doubt, load more than you think you'll need rather than less, because running out of fuel at 4 in the morning while you're asleep is a far worse outcome than having some left over in the morning. The third mistake is skipping the practice runs on your specific smoker before attempting a full unattended overnight cook. Every pit has its own personality, and the first time you ever trust it to run completely alone for 8 or 10 hours should not be the first time you're testing whether it can actually hold steady that long in the first place. The fourth mistake is wrapping too early before the briskets genuinely hit the stall out of nervousness about leaving it alone longer. Wrapping early traps the meat in a stage where it hasn't developed enough bark yet, and you end up with a softer, less defined crust than the method's actually capable of producing. Trust the internal temperature reading over the clock and let the stall actually happen before you commit to the wrap. A few questions people ask me regularly once they've tried an overnight cook using this method themselves. What if you wake up in the middle of the night anyway and want to check on it? Check your probe reading from bed if you've got a remote system, and leave the lid closed unless something's genuinely wrong, meaning a real temperature drop that's continued for a while rather than a brief, normal fluctuation. Opening the lid just because you're awake and curious defeats a large part of the reason this method works in the first place. What if your pit runs hot overnight instead of holding steady? A brisket finishing a little early isn't a disaster the way running out of fuel is. If your temperature probe shows the brisket's approaching done before you're awake, it'll typically hold well wrapped in a cooler for several hours past that point, which actually works in your favor for a morning finish rather than against you. What if you don't have a smoker that can realistically hold unattended for 8 or more hours? Cheaper smokers with smaller fireboxes sometimes genuinely can't run this long without intervention, no matter how well you build the fire. In that case, a single scheduled wake up to refuel partway through the night, timed to the specific burn rate you've observed on your own practice runs, is a reasonable middle ground rather than abandoning the method entirely. What if you're nervous about food safety leaving meat cooking unattended overnight? A properly running smoker holding in the 225 to 240 range keeps the brisket well above the danger zone throughout the entire cook, the same as any actively tended cook would. The unattended part of this method refers to fire management and basting. not to running the meat at an unsafe temperature. And a reliable remote thermometer is exactly the tool that lets you confirm that without ever having to physically check. That's genuinely the whole method start to finish, questions included. A fire built from the first log for a long, slow, self-sustaining burn, instead of one you plan to feed by hand through the night. A wrap timed to the stall instead of a spray bottle managing moisture from outside. A remote thermometer doing the watching so you don't have to. And the trust built through a few practice runs first to actually walk away and let the whole thing work the way it's designed to. Half the effort of a day cook you're babysitting every hour, and a brisket that's often better for it, because steady, undisturbed heat over time is what built bark and rendered fat backing before anyone thought spritzing every hour was necessary in the first place. Load your pit tonight, wrap it in butcher paper somewhere around 165 instead of reaching for the spray bottle, and go to bed.